Hello, and welcome to the Conversations in Time podcasts from the ORC. In this podcast, the guys will be talking about historical what-ifs, or counterfactual history for the aficionados in the audience.
Hello, and welcome to another podcast from the ORC, or Officially Retired Club, Conversations in Time series. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G. Nice to speak to you again.
Right, so we're still in the ORCU, and for those who remember, that's Officially Retired Get the Virtual Universe.
Thanks, Mr. John, because I think I'd forgotten that, but anyway.
Yeah, well, you're getting old now, mate.
That's it.
So, where are we today? It's a what if, and...
So what we thought we'd do today would be slightly different from some of the other ones, perhaps, but we thought we'd discuss what would happen, or what could have happened if the internal combustion engine had not been invented, developed, and we don't have to worry about levels of development. It just isn't here. It's either here and it doesn't work very well, it's a curiosity, or it just isn't here because it doesn't work.
That's right.
So I guess we need to quickly sort of think of the impact of the internal combustion engine. We won't worry too much about diesel versus petrol. I mean, we're talking about burning mineral oil form of some form into diesel or petrol, either by compression or spark plugs, as in petrol, and powering an engine. So that isn't working. But look at the impact it has in our modern environment. Obviously, we have automobile cars, we have diesel engine vehicles that do huge things like carrying around 40 tons of goods between shops. We have massive bulldozers, etc., etc. We have ships. So that doesn't exist, or didn't exist. So, imagine the impact not having that we'd have. So let's have a chat. I mean,
let's go back to the beginning then.
Yeah, okay.
Right, so the actual patent for the internal combustion engine is the mid-1800s. So that was roughly the time period from where, the initial concepts and developments began, and we can move it forward from there. So it's at a part in the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution will have started. That would have carried on. Obviously, we had steam engines was the current workhorse as a replacement for human manpower. So if we start there, I mean, the early, motor manufacturer is something a bit later. That's more of a 1900s type thing. So in the late 1800s, it probably wouldn't have made a huge difference. I wouldn't say it was an oddity, but they were more in the background.
No, it certainly wasn't in commercial use. So it might have been in the 1890s and stuff. There might have been the odd entrepreneur or inventor with an engine, and he may have attached that to a carriage. As in the terms of the haulage carriage, but there was no commercial usage of combustion engines, until the 1900s, and it wasn't really in massive commercial use, arguably, until the 1920s, and that was really kickstarted by the First World War in terms of trucks, and it wasn't really used in, for example, shipping. Well into the 1930s, diesel engines in ships were novelties, certainly in the Second World War. I mean, some warships had them, some German ones did, but most warships didn't, and most freighters were still working on steam turbines or steam reciprocating engines. That's not to say there wasn't diesel engines in ships, but they were unusual. So the combustion engine came into its own in the 1910s and 1920s with cars and trucks, and then commercially everywhere, arguably 1930s, 50s, and obviously it was everywhere but after the Second World War. So it's that early 20th century we're looking at. So I guess we're looking at what was the impact to the early 20th century, or what would be the impact to the early 20th century of it not having happened. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that some of the earliest cars or horseless carriages were electric, interestingly enough, weren't they?
So I think that we'll have to make a decision as to whether we consider electric vehicles, which, as you said, at the time were quite popular around the same time as the internal combustion engine cars or vehicles that were being produced. Ultimately, I believe that Henry Ford had a big impact on the removal of electric vehicles from the road because of the cheap nature of the the product that he produced versus the electric equivalent, which was very expensive. So I think it'd be best to assume that the electric vehicle would have continued. That's a separate type of technology, not related to internal combustion. So let's, for the purposes of our discussion, assume that electric motors would have carried on.
Yeah, but battery
Pretty good. Don't think of them as a Tesla.
Well, no, exactly. So battery technology has only really become usable in the sense that we consider combustion engine vehicles in the last 10 to 15 years. So it's hard to imagine that battery technology would have been any better in the early 20th century just because it didn't have a major competitor. And frankly, usually, if you don't have a competitor or a very good competitor, your technology stagnates because what are you competing against? So
I agree with that. I would say that and we're going off topic a little bit, because we're talking about electric vehicles rather than the lack of internal combustion engines. But I think that if there would have been widespread adoption of an electric vehicle, then development on the range, which is the big deal with electric vehicles, would have been an issue. And we're talking about chemistry, which I'm no chemist, so I don't know how far chemistry has come in 100 years. And there's difference between the theoretical understanding of how a battery works versus the practical implementation of that chemistry. Now, the chemistry may have been understood earlier if more people put more effort into it. Doesn't necessarily mean that.
What's the incentive to put any effort into it? I mean, if you've got a
don't
product,
forget that electric vehicles in the early 1900s were becoming more and more popular. So they were being produced. It was just that cars with an internal combustion engine were that much cheaper. Well, so therefore, it had a bigger adoption, and people gave up on electric vehicles. But the range on an electric vehicle was significantly less than a.
Yeah, exactly. So if there's no competitor, there's many analogy. I mean, if you've got a product which is the only product on the market, you like it or lump it. And what's the incentive to improve?
Why would you say that's the only product on the market? There's
okay, but all right, yeah, okay. So there
were multiple electric car vendors even in the 1900s.
Well, indeed, but that's an interesting point. No, you're right. So your thesis, so to speak, is that electric vehicle technology would have improved because they were competing against each other. Is that? I mean, I can see that. That's logical. Yeah. No, okay.
But then, okay, so we can assume that, we'll park the fact that electric vehicles are potentially, and it may come back later on in terms of what potential impact that could have relieved in the absence of internal combustion engines. So one of the things that I want to highlight without internal combustion engines is that we wouldn't have any tractors. So the tractor was invented around about the 1890s, round about that period. And up until then, farmers used horses, and there were some traction engines and farm engines. But
farmers use a lot of traction engines. I mean, if you think of a tractor, the modern tractor does many things, but I guess its primary purpose was pulling a plough. Now, traction engines didn't pull ploughs; they sat in the corners of fields. They didn't pull ploughs behind them. I mean, they sat in the corner of the field, and depending on the type of field, it depends on the topography of the field. But you would have a great big rope that pulled a plough across the field and back again. So what
I'm trying to highlight is the fact that the agricultural expansion would have been significantly less.
Yeah, indeed, because each farmer didn't have their own traction engine. They had to get the local guy with the traction engine would come around their field. It was hardly just a question of jumping in the shed and switching the tractor on and off you go. And the tractor obviously was developed to do all sorts of other things. But why couldn't, or why wouldn't, but what I was going to mention, why wouldn't steam engines be developed to be an equivalent, if you like, of a combustion engine? Now, we all have a chat about that. There's all sorts of limitations there, but why couldn't you have a lightweight?
Well, it's not possible to have a lightweight steam. So there were actually steam tractors, and one of the issues with steam tractors is what type of soil they are actually trying to plough. So in the UK, they weren't very effective because the ground is too soft, and they just.
But why
horses?
But why were they so heavy?
Because you've got to have a big boiler with water and coal.
Oh, but do you
plough up and down the field?
Well, you certainly do, and you certainly did in that timeline technology. There's no doubt about it. But is it not feasible that somebody could I mean, the traditional
No, but this is
boiler.
in the same type of timescale as the early development of
Well, okay.
ICE. So there's no real alternative. It's like people are looking at this as steam power has been around a long time.
Mhm.
They can see that it can do stuff. They're trying to implement it in agriculture, and it's not turning out to be as effective as they would hope.
Yeah, no, okay. I
Certainly
get
in the US, it was more, I would say, prevalent, but it would work.
I mean, I do have a counter to that, but let's not go there yet. I get your point of view that the way that things evolve, people don't sit in a room and think, "Oh, hang on a minute, I don't have a combustion engine. I need a super efficient, lightweight steam engine instead." That doesn't happen.
That
Might
no,
happen
that-
eventually.
That's right. So they're going to start developing with it. Yeah, so they'll develop with a heavy steam engine. I'm not saying that steam engine technology wouldn't have improved, got lighter.
No, I agree, but it wouldn't just got
probably,
light in the same timeline as the combustion engine stroke tractor. So certainly in the UK, I guess the tractor became ubiquitous. Certainly after the Second World War, maybe it was starting to do so in the 1930s. Not every farmer could afford one, but certainly after the Second World War, rather that became the norm, whether it was by subsidy or just the ramp up of American industrial power after the war. Stop making tanks, start making tractors. So what's the impact of not having mechanized farming then, or not having having it as mechanized as it would have been with the tractor?
I mean, ultimately, it would. My view is that the amount of crops that could be grown is probably reduced.
Well, is it, or is it just more labour intensive?
Well, maybe it's more labour intensive.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt that tractors have improved how crops are grown, whatever. And if you're relying on steam power, then yes, you can have an equivalent. But would it be as quick? Would it be as effective? Would it be as cost effective? There's those types of things. So I think that you're right that from an agricultural perspective, the impact would have been less, but there would have been an impact.
Yeah, but I mean, you think most, again, not everything in my head revolves around the Second World War. I can hear people disagreeing in the background. But but if you think of Britain during the Second World War, most fields, most land that was able to one degree or another to be planted upon. There's probably a term for it, but was, and not tractors were coming on then, but there was still an awful lot of horse-drawn stuff. So I think I agree with you that it would have an impact. I think the impact is not necessarily. The impact is everything becomes harder. I think it's not. I don't think it's impossible. So I think you're still growing stuff. You just need lots more farm labourers. Arguably, you're not growing the same stuff. Some stuff, if you can't get it out of the field quickly enough to have it made into food, essentially, either by freezing out, which again is much later, or even just storing it out of the rain. If you can't do that quickly enough, you don't grow it. You grow something else, and maybe you have to import it from somewhere where it's less of an issue. So some things that perhaps are grown in the 50s, 60s, 70s, oilseed rape, sweet corn, they aren't grown. But something else, so we're subsiding on turnips and potatoes as we had done for the previous 150, 300, 400 years.
So absolutely. So from that perspective, there would be some sort of impact limiting factor, or it would be a much more labour intensive industry than it is today, or was then. So there would be a lot more farm workers, and you'd still need to have that many farm workers. It wouldn't be something that is
which
as
again,
mechanized or automated as it is today.
Looking at the social aspect of that means there's conversely less people available to work in towns and sit in factories, and in the post-war boom, because there just aren't. Maybe that has impacts to increased immigration. Obviously, there was quite a lot of immigration anyway, but even more immigration to fill the factories or to fill the farms, to let people come out of the factories as economies change. No, it's interesting that there are statistics
another aspect then. So ultimately, we've discussed one feature. So agriculture, it's over there. That's going to have some sort of impact. So let's come on to one of your favourite subjects then. So this would have happened it's happened just before the First World War.
Yeah.
And so we're now saying it won't happen. So the First World War is still likely to happen. I don't think there's anything in relation to apart from the fact that Prince Ferdinand was in a car. So he wouldn't be in a car, he'd be in a horse-drawn carriage.
Probably. That's a good one. That's a good one. Yeah, he would have been. Well, he'd been in a horse-drawn carriage, I guess. But yeah,
Yeah, so let's assume that the First World War still...
Which is interesting, though, just because if I remember my Franz Ferdinand right, his driver got lost and reversed up the street to do a U-turn, and Gavrilo Princip was sitting outside a cafe and shot him. If he was in a horse-drawn carriage, he couldn't have reversed up the street to do a U-turn. He'd have gone somewhere else and he wouldn't have got shot. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
Damn you, internal combustion.
Yeah, exactly. The cause of the First World War was the internal combustion engine. Anyway, let's not worry too much about that one.
So, First World War then.
Well, one of the first mechanized wars, not the first. I mean, the obvious one straight away is there wouldn't be any airplanes.
That's right.
A super efficient, lightweight steam engine of some mythical future date to be invented, wouldn't have existed in the 1900s, 1910s.
Maybe we could come on to flight later, but yeah, I mean, ultimately, air travel.
The biggest thing, there was lots of trucks, and famously the London buses transporting British soldiers up to the front, and French ones as well from Paris. They would have got there eventually, but they would have they may not have turned up in time to stop the Germans at various battles. But would that have resulted in the Germans winning? No, they would just be closer to Paris, I suspect.
So the Navy ultimately wouldn't have been impacted because it was steam powered.
Yeah.
So from a naval perspective, that would have carried on.
I mean, the obvious one is so let's presume that no lorries. Well, fine, you use wagons. The Germans were using, even well into the Second World War, mostly horse-drawn transport, despite what you might see in newsreels and stuff all the time. But there's the tank. I mean, the tank was very heavy in the first place, so having a big steam engine in it probably wouldn't have made a huge difference. But
except it would have to have been bigger and heavier.
Yeah. Yeah, well, possibly, but yeah. But
don't forget, you've got to carry water, and you've got to carry coal, and you've got to have a boiler to create the steam.
You're right. You're right. You forget, but yes, you're absolutely right about the coal aspect. I'd forgotten that. You think of a steam engine, and you forget with the tender behind it with all the coal in it. Yes, so that would have been quite impractical. That's not to say they wouldn't have tried it. The question is really, did the tank have a significant impact in the First World War? Well, arguably it did, and arguably it didn't, and a whole other conversation. I suspect the breakouts of the Allied armies in 1918 would have happened anyway. Again, tanks helped, they reduced casualties, but they weren't, with one or two exceptions where they caught the Germans unawares, but then eventually collectively broke down or got stuck. Or were taken out by artillery. They never had a breakthrough that resulted in a strategic difference. So again, if you look at the wars previously to it, in South Africa and the Franco-Prussian.
Well, that's probably as good an example. Or like you say, the Franco-Prussian one.
Yeah, they didn't exist, and the wars
they still had Industrial Revolution weapons, didn't they?
Yeah,
so they had rifles, machine guns,
modern explosives.
Yeah,
as you say, machine guns, repeating, breech-loading artillery, which you could that you didn't have to recite every time you fired it, etc., etc. Shrapnel, indirect fire, spotted by balloons and all that sort of stuff. So yes, and that was the major killer in the war, not mechanized armored cars or tanks. So let's pause a second, John. There's an echo appeared from somewhere. Have you done something with your microphone or your speaker?
No.
Well,
yeah, go in now.
No, it's stopped now. But it was like that. Okay, never mind. All right, start again. So I think the impact to the First World War is, again, like some of the things we've talked about. It's the human aspect. Unfortunately, is more people die, but it has no material difference in terms of the outcome.
Okay, so First World War is more of a slaughterhouse potentially.
Yep.
There was plenty.
May take longer.
It probably would take longer. The battles would be different.
Yeah.
The outcome, based on how it ended, was arguably inevitable once the Americans came into the fray. So, okay, the next bit, and I don't know whether this is something that you've thought of, but material science. So one of the early 1900s sort of inventions that I'm not saying is necessarily related. There is a relation to internal combustion engines, and I'll explain it in a minute. which is the development of plastic.
Okay.
Now, plastic is a man-made substance which comes from hydrocarbons.
Uh-huh.
So ultimately, it comes from oil. So you could still make it, but if you consider now that there's a lot of plastic, but there's a lot more oil produced for internal combustion engines. So of all of the global oil production in the world, only 4% of it is used for producing plastics. Now, would that make it for me? I don't know how far that would have gone, because plastics would have been a lot more expensive if the only reason for pulling oil out of the ground would be to produce this man-made.
Yeah. So you're saying it wouldn't be economic to drill, certainly in certain parts of the world, it wouldn't be economic to drill in Alaska and the North Sea and various,
That's right.
areas.
Yeah.
If you were producing that purely for plastic, because the current price of plastic in Vericom wouldn't justify that. I agree.
No.
That's interesting. So there would be no North Sea oil. Well, there would be North Sea oil, but it would still be under the sea.
We can talk about because that's another, one of these things where without the actual requirement for oil, so no internal combustion engine, no real driver for drilling holes in the Earth's crust.
Yeah.
Certain parts of the country, the world, would have a completely different outlook. Saudi,
well,
Russia.
exactly. So that's massive, isn't it? So the oil in America, or certainly the oil that was extracted in the early 20th century and all the way up to the 70s in America, was reasonably easy to get to in Alaska and stuff. Not Alaska, Texas.
California.
Yeah, California. It's close to the surface. It's in some cases oozing out the ground. If you're only requiring 4% of the current usage, you don't need to import it. You would need to import any into America. So the development of Arabian oil in the 50s and 60s was American and British led. They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't need to. There's no business in it. There's no money in it. So Saudi Arabia remains an agrarian stroke economy based on very little, frankly. Yeah, they're happy themselves, but don't have to interact with anybody. The impact that has to their neighbours, even the ones with oil. Again, the ones currently with oil wouldn't have any money. The Kuwaits, the Dubais, would they have had the vision to turn themselves into these new states of trading, entertainment, and banking and stuff? Probably not.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that they'd be a completely different landscape.
It's difficult to it's trying to think of an equivalent, but there are Arab states with no oil. Syria doesn't have a huge amount, but it's an ancient country, so to speak. So its economy was based on its internal.
Not as much the desert as Saudi.
Well, indeed. So its internal economy was based on oil and stuff. But again, it's not got the backing of all the other states. So it would be a mediumly poor country amongst other poor countries. So the whole arc of that area would be completely different. The world wouldn't care about it to any degree, which is probably to their advantage sometimes. But some of the conflicts, the obvious thing, despite what many people might think, I don't personally believe that a lot of the conflict in the Middle East is due to oil. People, America and the West only fought Saddam Hussein because of oil. No, they only fought Saddam Hussein because of what he was threatening to do. And I'm not even talking about the Second War, I'm talking about the First Gulf War. Now, he couldn't have bought all those weapons if he hadn't done oil. So that would never have happened, because Saddam Hussein might have been there, but he would have been in charge of a very poor country. It would have been no threat to anybody. The strategic difference is massive there, really. America would be self-sufficient in plastic oil. Some countries might...
It's no doubt that I don't know what other oil deposits are like. The American oil deposits are fairly well, from our perspective, we have seen film and stuff like that show that it was easy to get to. There must be other parts of the world where it's equally accessible. Now, if the Americans
in the wrong part of the world, isn't it? It's not. The reason that it's accessible in America is that it's in America. Yet
what I mean is if the products themselves became commercially viable, then more effort might be put into finding it accessible.
You've still got to ship them to, even if it's easy to drill, you've still got to ship it to your market. Whereas in America, your market's 100 miles away, or even at worst, 1,000.
Absolutely, but the Americans still had to ship it to Asia and Africa, South America, all these countries. Whereas you could end up with a smaller if there is a easily accessible oil deposits in other parts of the country, in other parts of the world, I mean, who knows what industries may have, even an American company might have started factories, whatever, in those regions.
Yeah, to meet the local market.
Yeah, it's feasible.
Sorry to interrupt. The local market for oil stroke petrol is obvious. The local market for plastic is not so obvious. It's not even plastic. It's something you can make into plastic. So, if you take oil out of the ground, it's easy to refinery. It's not a complicated process. You build a refinery, it's relatively simple. We've all done it at chemistry classes, the various cracking levels. And you've got a ready-made market for it. If you don't have a ready-made, if you don't have automobiles and scooters and generators, you don't have a market. You've got a market for a product you can make it into something else which could be useful to somebody. So that's not, where you could see America developing that. It's difficult to say, in Indonesia, which has got a huge oil deposit, say, right, we've got this stuff. If you drill this down there and create this industry, you can have this oil, and then if you create another industry, you can make it into plastic. And if you create half a dozen or several thousand other industries, you can use it for plastic chairs, plastic toys, everything, widgets, anything you can have, plastic bags. It's difficult to make that direct relationship. That's not to say it wouldn't happen over a very long time period, but there's not an obvious reason for Indonesians to make a plastic industry out of their oil, whereas to use it in cars is obvious, isn't it?
No, I agree, but don't forget what we haven't mentioned and what we haven't said is, so if the Industrial Revolution was not impacted, certainly in the late 1900s, how much of an impact would it have had in the the mid 20th century? I don't think, in terms of the advancement of technologies. So now internal combustion engine, but other things can still happen. You don't need an internal combustion engine to produce a computer, for example.
No, but you do have to have a viable thrusting economy. And certainly, if you look at America as a model, and the reason that I'm mentioning America is because in the 1930s, 40s, and again, guys, Google this out there, but America had 8 times as many cars as somewhere quite advanced as Germany, and 7 times as France, and 7 times as Britain. It was turbocharging the economy. Sorry?
You're talking about before the Second World War?
Yes, or just after the Second World War. So it's turbocharging the economy. You can set up a business. I can set up a business as anything, a plumber, a carpenter, and I can travel in a radius of 20, 30, 40 miles, depending on the population density that I need to. And I can do that as a business. And anybody else can do that. All I need is a Model T Ford with a flatbed truck, a flatbed on it. If I don't have that, I've got a horse and cart or some other technology, which we'll come on to, but I've got a horse and cart where I can maybe travel 5 miles to go to service my business. And if you think of that's just as a single trader type role. If you think of that as a company, I become a company that has 25 vehicles to do whatever it is my business is, delivery,
Oh, but there's a counter argument to it's a counter argument.
And that's supercharging my economy. It's opening up opportunities in the economy that wouldn't otherwise exist.
But the American economy grew with the introduction of the railways.
Correct.
And there weren't any, and that was not related to internal.
Yeah, but it exploded in the 20th century. Now, it wasn't just all because of the war, but it absolutely,
absolutely. You can't deny that. Without the internal combustion engine, America would be a significantly different country to the one it is today. No doubt about that. But ultimately, it's still not going to be a third world, agricultural place.
Well, my point, you don't need a combustion engine to make a computer, correct? But you need somebody to conceive of the computer. You need somebody to build a computer. Would those people? Would the economy have been sufficiently rich to allow people to go to university in the 1950s to learn these techniques, to conceive of these techniques, to build these things?
But the cities, arguably, the cities existed before the First World War. We're just talking about the US. I mean, it's the same around the world. In the UK, the large cities still existed. There were still universities. People were doing stuff.
Yeah, but they weren't buying consumer goods until arguably the start of the 20th century.
You could buy consumer goods before. Consumerism didn't occur in the 1950s. I mean, you used to be able to buy.
Oh, indeed, but it exploded in the early 20th century.
So it would be more a foot than a boom. So it's going to be a lot slower. But it's not as if it's not going to, as if nothing happens. It's not going to stagnate. I don't believe so. I think that the pace of change would be a lot slower, but change would still be occurring.
Much slower. People wouldn't. I mean, at all levels of the economy, people wouldn't move house so often. People wouldn't move to new towns. I'm talking both in the UK and Europe and America.
Globally. That's right. Yeah.
People wouldn't because people wouldn't unless the government and in America less likely are prepared to spend significant part of GDP on public transport that replicates, for example, London and New York in every single town. They
may have to. I mean, it doesn't mean to say that they have underground or subway.
No, indeed. But in terms of, I mean, we're, spoiler here, you can probably tell by John's voice and not my voice, I've got a Scottish accent, honestly, but we're based in the Midlands, and traditionally in the UK, London takes a vast chunk of the transport budget. If you look at the London transport system, Birmingham is poorly served in comparison, and probably with the exception of Manchester, every other city in the UK is. If everybody didn't have easy access, certainly in the 50s or 60s, to a combustion engine car, they got to maintain the same amount of growth in housing and light industry and stuff to get people from A to B to support the economy. You have to have something else, and that means trams and trolley buses and bus buses.
You can't have bus buses because they've got an internal combustion engine.
Correct, indeed. All right, but I've got an alternative for that. But we'll come on to that near then.
Yeah.
But light railway, electric trolley buses, electric trams. Listen, in every housing estate would need one. Which spoiler for those who don't live in London, we don't outside London, and we don't outside New York and Washington or all the rest of it. Chicago, whatever.
Be as mobile. I think that's.
But the point being is that
walking.
If your workforce isn't mobile, your economy doesn't grow as much. It doesn't grow at all, arguably. And if your economy is not growing, you're not building that incentive to build computers and flat screen TVs. And
well, I think that I disagree that it wouldn't grow. I think that it would just be slower. I think that particularly in the US, which is such a large country, it would still grow. Yeah,
it would grow, but it wouldn't grow as anything like it. I mean, if you look at the UK economy, it hasn't really grown in the last 15 years, and that has massive knock-on effects, all sorts of things. The rate of growth is important as well. If you have growth of 1-2%, 0.3%, which apparently is fantastic in this country now, that has over 30, 40, 50 years. That's almost no growth at all. You have to have these huge spurts.
Yeah.
The white heat of technology, the booms.
So let's take a trip back a bit. So let's come back to now internal combustion engine, because we are going off into
as we always do.
As we always do.
Yeah.
First World War over and done with, and then we get into the 30s, and you could say that the causes of the Second World War still would be there. The Treaty of Versailles, creating the problem in Germany, the rise of the Nazis, blah, blah, blah. The Second World War was likely, so we'll make the assumption that it's going to happen again, but would be totally different this time, because it would be more like the First World War without the tanks, because there would be no aircraft, no tanks. It would be horse-drawn.
Well, but then do we want
guns?
Do we want to talk now about alternative technology?
Yeah, far away.
Right, so there's two things I thought of before we did. Again, looking at my knowledge of military things a little bit. Torpedoes, and I won't go on a massive tangent. Torpedoes are powered by compressed air. It has a compressed air engine, essentially. You have a tank of compressed air, you put it through a turbine, it turns a torpedo. So a compressed air engine is incredibly inefficient in terms of the amount of effort you have to put into compress the air into a tank, equaling what it sticks out the back of the turbine. But militaries generally don't care about don't really care about efficiency. So you could have a compressed air engine that would drive a vehicle. Whether it would be economic, it would be interesting enough. It would be economic today because potentially you could compress the air with solar power or wind power, solar powered electricity and wind powered electricity, which is inverted commas free, minus the cost of the equipment, obviously. But so there's definitely technology that could have been developed. And I say it would have been developed, could have been developed to power something. And again, when humankind's looking to kill each other, it usually comes up with a solution of some sort. The alternative is well, which was looked at significantly in the 1960s or certainly 70s by China, is a steam engine based on coal powder. So, as we all know or recall from school, if you put a dry combustible substance into a powder, you increase the surface area by massive factors. Think of a lump of coal. If you smash all that up, a lump of coal, you throw it in air and there's a spark, it doesn't burst into flames. If you compress a lump of coal into fine powder, throw it into air near a candle, it will explode. It's the way that flour mills used to explode. But you don't associate flour as an explosive substance. But if all the flour is exposed to a flame all at the same time, it explodes. So there was work done by the China Railways. I have been doing a bit of Googling on this to power steam-powered locomotives by coal powder rather than coal. And you need still quite a lot of coal, obviously, but you can store it in a means that is, essentially similar to a liquid if it's fine enough.
Yeah. So I mean,
there are
technologies. Steam power would have continued, and that type of efficiency benefit, the efficiency gaining through more effective use of the combustible element, it would have happened. So where that would take things from a military perspective, I mean, even a commercial perspective, who knows? It's still not going to give you the agility of a vehicle with an internal combustion engine, because coal's just not that good a way of getting energy out of the
compressed air could be. You have tanks.
Well, I don't know. Let's hope we get some comments on that one, because to me that feels more about power to weight ratio. It would be interesting to see if you put a torpedo on the land and got it to turn the air to turn an axle, rather than something that's floating in the water or is made some buoyancy because of the water, and it's going through something that's less resistant than
the torpedoes go into the water, so it's still getting some. I mean, water resistance is more significant than air resistance, but
it's not air. It's the ground. It's overcoming the ground resistance. Is the what and going.
Well, you're right. It's the inertia of gravity, I suppose. But yeah, you're right. And and it's less friction. Than the ground. I'll give you that. But it's certainly torpedoes of that era, and it could go a long way at high speed. So it was a reasonably efficient engine. Again, how long it would last, whether they could reuse it more than 4 times or 2 times, whether it blow up. You couldn't exactly jump in it and say, I'll get 100,000 miles at my compressed air engine. I have no idea, to be honest. But there was definitely, a means of getting from A to B using compressed air. How efficient?
So let's just make the assumption that there would be some alternative. The concept of an armoured vehicle would still have appealed to the military. Let's say that. I mean, because there would still be vehicles. There would be steam-powered vehicles, even in a commercial sense. So the military. So from a Second World War perspective, we are making the assumption that there would be some form of armoured, whatever it would be. It is likely to be a lot bigger, a lot heavier, and with the same armour, carrying the same type of gun, potentially. Because don't forget, it's got to be armoured as well, and that's weight. All I'm saying is that, if we want to talk about the Second World War, it would still be significantly different. I mean, no air battles,
no,
only ground and sea warfare. That's
so it's interesting in relation to the war in the Atlantic then. So there'd be
steam-powered ships. That's the other thing as well.
But submarines... There were steam-powered submarines in the early 1920s in the Royal Navy, and they were totally disastrous. However, it was possible. So if again, if you want to Google it, Google the K class. It wasn't just a band 20 years ago. The K class of Royal Navy submarines had a steam turbine in it, and I think about 8 were built and 4 sunk. And this was peacetime, basically because they have steam engines require large holes in terms of smoke and steam out and air in. Obviously, combustion engines do as well, but they don't need quite as big holes. And the process for closing those holes was less than perfect.
There's another problem with a submarine as well, is you don't use seawater, you've still got to use normal, you can't use seawater in a steam engine. It's got to be...
Well, that's true, but that's true of steam-powered ships, and you have a desalination process.
But a ship is significantly bigger than a submarine.
Well, it doesn't have to be, but
you still need to have quite a lot of water to be able to steam.
Yeah, you create your own water, but you're right. It's just everything's more complicated. So it's interesting. There would have been submarines. It wouldn't have been as efficient, but then it wouldn't have been aircraft to attack them.
But I don't think they would have gone out into the mid-Atlantic. I don't think you would have a submarine that had that range. Don't forget, you've got to carry all the coal as well.
Well, indeed.
And all right, coal dust. You've still got to have a coal class load.
The K class were huge by the standards of the diesel equivalents at the time. I don't know what the range is. You'd have to Google it. But you're right. Whether they could actually have as big a range. But then on the other hand, if you've got large parts of the ocean which aren't covered by aircraft, maybe you have what they used to call milk cows or mother submarines, where they would just be there with provisions and weren't there to attack vessels because if they know that they're not going to be attacked by aircraft. Because
I wonder what would have been brought across the Atlantic. There wouldn't have been any tanks or any armoured vehicles or aircraft because they didn't exist, and they would have been on steam-powered ships. So it largely would have been food and some raw materials.
Well, not necessarily. You're still shipping weapons, guns, and stuff. Yeah,
but they're a lot smaller. You can carry a lot of.
Well,
those.
But then the American shipbuilding industry was producing Liberty ships at dozens a week. I don't think there was a shortage. Once they got going, there wasn't a shortage of shipping as such.
No, but what I'm saying is what are they carrying? I mean, don't forget there wouldn't be the car factories that were in the US that would turn to war production wouldn't have been there because there'd be no cars being produced, no factories. So the US
I know you shot me down right at the start. I think there would be cars. I just don't think they'd be very good ones. I think they'd be electric or steam. I mean, there were plenty of steam lorries around in the 1920s. I think, as we discussed, that even if there wasn't a direct competitor, or as you put me right, arguably, even if there wasn't a direct competitor to electric vehicles that would drive improvement, the differing companies looking for the same market would drive improvement. I kind of think that something would have been there. It wouldn't have been anything like as equivalent to the combustion engine because a gallon of petrol is an equivalent of it's a huge amount of energy, and it's I can visualize. I don't know what the equivalent in coal is, but a lot. An equivalent even of a modern battery is surprisingly big, and so these vehicles would have been poor. They might have had a limited speed. The means of refueling them would have been difficult. But if you're looking specifically at the Second World War, the small industry that might have existed to support these poor vehicles for rich people would have happily have been used by the military who don't actually, during war, have to worry about where the money's coming from.
There is actually there's an alternative way of potentially looking at this, in that if you say that steam power was the way that technology moved forward for vehicles, and the restriction was coal, because coal was something that burned, you would try and find something else that would burn more effectively and was more efficient. And gas,
what's that?
So gas is a more efficient.
That's cheating, John. That's just cheating.
It's not cheating. So if there is development in trying to improve steam engines, or steam-based propulsion, then having a different combustible element would
the premise of this
maybe gas.
What if the internal combustion engine is, if you're burning LPG, liquid petroleum gas, is that not a combustion in an engine?
But that's using it as an alternative to in a piston. So we're not talking about gas in the piston. We're talking about gas heating the water.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, arguably you could talk about that in the same way as gasoline or petrol. But yeah, you're right.
Because that sort of, does it lend that way? It would be funny if suddenly people were drilling for oil to create a combustible liquid to feed a steam engine.
It's interesting. I can't.
Could happen, you know.
Yeah, I'm trying to visualize. Yeah, if you think about old-fashioned toy trains or model trains going back even to the late Victorian era, I think they were powered by some sort of oil, but was creating steam. So they were steam. I'm not aware of a full-scale commercial steam locomotive powered by mineral oil or distilled petroleum or whatever. But I can visualize either it's stately homes or the sort of places that have rides for children, a big round on a big loop somewhere through the formal gardens. You visualize that sort of thing, where I'm sure many of those miniature steam locomotives are actually powered by a combustible oil of some sort. So that's a definite option. But a steam engine is still incredibly inefficient in comparison to a combustion engine.
Well,
so,
but the what if is no combustion engine. So
yeah, indeed.
We don't want to suddenly go, and then 50 years later it's developed.
So what you've probably got then is a fleet of slow vehicles that require quite a lot of care, because you can't just flick a switch. You've got to flick a switch an hour before you want the vehicle. So you leave it running, or you leave it boiling, for want of a better expression, overnight, bubbling away. But then you jump in it and off you go, and it belches steam as you're going. But it could develop into quite a stylish looking thing. You still need water, obviously. So you've got two tanks. You've got a tank of water and a tank of whatever, gas or petrol, diesel. Well, no, diesel doesn't work because diesel doesn't combust. But in that, without being compressed. But you can envisage those vehicles driving around, and it would look reasonably normal, but it just would be more inconvenient. And you can envisage that people or engineers would tweak them and make them more efficient by various mechanisms.
Yeah, the desire to have some sort of personal transportation,
yeah,
would have driven the technology in a different direction to the way it's gone.
Yeah, I mean steam turbines.
ICE,
Yeah, steam turbines are once you've got the steam turbines are very efficient and can create an incredible amount of power. I think nuclear power stations, essentially turning turbines.
Yeah, I don't think nuclear is different, but
I'm using that as an example. I mean, once you've got steam, and once you've got super hot steam at pressure, you can create an incredible amount of power. I think the big ocean liners were all steam turbine powered. They weren't these big clanky up and down engines. They were massive steam turbines creating an incredible amount of power. You talked about metallurgy before or materials science. That again, that would have driven the problem with miniaturizing a steam turbine is that the stresses on what is available, that makes it the weight possible. I essentially have to have a very heavy engine, so whether that would have driven metallurgy, so some of the things that came along in the 60s that were used on aircraft and stuff like Concorde, whether they would have been utilized for steam turbines that would fit in a car, and essentially you would never tell, you put your foot down and it's just like a petrol car. I suspect that might have happened. Again, it's may have been driven by something else. Again, there have been attempts to drive vehicles by turbines, albeit gas turbines, but the principle's the same. You're putting a hot vapor through a turbine turning a shaft. So I think that's interesting. But I hadn't thought about what about boiling the water under pressure produces super hot steam, which has more energy in it, and you need less of it. You need less water because you have less steam.
Well, there's no doubt that as we said, the technology for steam engines would be significantly better than it is currently.
Yeah.
Just because of the amount of time and effort people would have been spending in trying to make it better.
Yeah. There was a steam turbine locomotive in the UK in the 1920s, but I can't remember. It like all these things, it was extremely expensive, not to run, but to build. And to think, well, why am I building an extremely expensive steam locomotive when I've got a relatively cheap one over here? Because of the friction on the rails and the engineering at the time, it wasn't significantly faster. It wasn't easier it was harder to maintain. Again, probably just because there wasn't the knowledge and the huge number of people who knew how to maintain it. But it was used, I think, for several years, and then they stopped using it. But yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Compressing compressing steam, firing it by petrol, and then developing your engine probably would have by the 1960s produced something that was indistinguishable from a combustion engine car.
Anyway, I think we're coming to the end. This one sort of shot by, I think, because we were...
No, but it's interesting because it just shows you the threads on these things are just incredible. That we, as we've said on some of these previous ones, you can always assume that X will equal Y, but the impacts are just what we think are the simple everyday objects, everyday occurrences. It's just incredible.
So, as with the other episodes, we always end with: do we think this was good? Was it bad? I think that the world is... It's difficult to say whether it's a better place because of ICE. It certainly would be a completely different world than it is today. There'd be less mobility, I think.
Yeah,
a lot more manual. A lot of tasks would be a lot more manual. I almost feel like it'd be more like the 50s type living.
Yes, I think less people would have their own vehicles, but then that might have driven more public transport in everyday towns rather than just capital cities.
We haven't got time to talk about global warming, unfortunately, but anyway, let's...
that blows your mind, really. You just start thinking about that.
That's for another one. So maybe we'll have to do another... Well, let's see if we get any comments in our Twitter feed about this, see whether it's worth having a second episode. It's certainly got plenty of legs, this one.
So to find us in Twitter, you can search in Conversations in Time. That's a generic term. You can search for the actual Twitter account, which is ORC_time, or if you put something along the lines of what would have happened if there'd been no internal combustion engine. There's an awful lot of words for Twitter, but if you put internal combustion engine or hashtag ICE, this will take you to a link in Twitter, which will take you to the pod, and leave us some comments, good, bad, or indifferent. If they're really bad, I'll delete them.
We don't get upset. We just read.
We don't get upset. No, we honestly want to hear some feedback.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. We shall catch you again on the next episode.
Bye, all.
Goodbye.
That's it. Now, we want to hear what you think. So those of you who are part of the Twitterati or X-rated or whatever it is these days, you can leave your comments, good or bad, at ORC_time. We love your feedback. Remember, if you liked this podcast, tell your friends. And if you didn't, tell your friends.